Evening. Welcome to another Sunday Speaker Series uh, program sponsored by this Illinois Sierra Club Woods and Wetlands Group. My name is Linda Tilton, and I will be your host this evening. Our program meetings feature speakers on topics relating to our environment, stewardship, wildlife and nature, public policy, and anything about outdoor activities like hiking and canoeing and bat and bird watching. In a minute, we will hear from our featured speaker, Liza Lehrer, Assistant Director of the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo. We have a couple of brief announcements before we get going. As Doug said, we are recording this so that you can watch it in the future. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to appear on the video. The camera is the little icon in the bottom left of your screen right next to the sound icon. We will email you the YouTube address for this program later this week so you can watch it again. Before we begin, please make sure you are muted, especially if you have a barking dog, a television, or other commotion in the background. Please feel free to ask any questions of our speaker, Liza, this evening by using the chat room at the bottom of your screen. We'll select questions afterwards and they will be directed to Liza. Now, let's move on to our November featured speaker. We first heard Liza Lehrer speak at the most recent Wild Things Conference. She is the Assistant Director of the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo. In her role, she leads Chicago-based biodiversity field research on terrestrial mammals, bats, and birds, aimed toward improving coexistence between humans and wildlife. We are delighted to welcome you, Liza. And again, we thank you for giving up your Sunday evening. You have the controls.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much for having me. I apologize, my video camera is straight ahead, but your faces are over here, so I might kind of look to the side a little bit just because I'm trying to look at you. Um, Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you about bats. As Linda mentioned, I am the assistant director at the Urban Wildlife Institute. This is my research group. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lincoln Park Zoo and the Conservation and Science Department there, but we have one of the largest conservation and science departments that's based at a zoo anywhere in the country. So you might not expect that since the footprint of our zoo is not very large, but we also actually have a pretty large, extensive science department. So we are one of the science centers based at the zoo. We were founded in 2010, and our mission is really to understand how wildlife live in cities in order to use that information to help make places more wildlife friendly and to reduce kind of negative human-wildlife interactions in cities. So we have a staff of 8 folks here, ranging from postdocs to kind of research coordinators. Our director there is the person here right in the middle on the top with the penguins, I think, in the background there. His name is Seth Magley. All right, so why are we a research center that's based on urbanization or urban wildlife? Well, of course, this is probably not a surprise to all of you, but urbanization is rapidly expanding across the world. It is 10% of the Earth's surface. Over 50% of the world's population now lives in cities. And it's the fastest growing form of land use change and the greatest human impact on the planet. And so, of course, this massive expansion and change in land cover reduces the amount of natural habitat that's available for wildlife and can have an enormous impact on conservation. And we know that cities can be really challenging places, right? So this is Chicago. It's You can see all of the impervious surface there. That's all roads and sidewalks, high density of buildings, of people. And although green spaces do exist in the Chicago area, and in fact, we're really fortunate to have a wealth of green spaces even here in the city, they can be quite disconnected. They can also be really small and not and fragmented, so not continuous. Animals are going to have to cross a lot of roads to be able to get to those spaces. So they can still pose a lot of challenges to wildlife, and then of course overall reduce the amount of habitat that's available to animals. And, historically, we really didn't think about cities as being places for wildlife. We assumed that they were kind of devoid of nature and really had no ecological value. But in the last like 20 to 30 or so years, the field of ecology has really
They were
come
meant
a
to
long
say
way.
something. As I
Um,
remember that the bats were on.
they've come a long way to sort of understand how cities can be really important places for conservation, that they can be really complex ecosystems. And what's really interesting to me about this field is that as much as we know about ecology is based on more natural areas and rural areas, and there's a lot that we really just don't know about how animals adapt and live in cities. And we're finding that many of them truly can. And what we sort of know about ecology really doesn't hold true in cities because there's a lot of novel forces and it's a very different and kind of complex system. So that's what makes it a really interesting kind of ecosystem to be studying. And that's why I'm really interested in it. So, when we set out at the Urban Wildlife Institute, we wanted to really, first kind of catalog what's out there and really understand what kinds of animals are living around us. At the time when we started out back in 2010, there really weren't a lot of people that were doing this type of research in the city of Chicago. Certainly, there was a lot of great research in the forest preserve districts outside of the city and the various county forest preserve districts, but we really didn't have a good sense of how animals were living in the urban core of Chicago. So we established this sampling transect. You see these kind of three lines and all of these dots. Those all represent sites where we've been sampling, and they've kind of ebbed and flowed over the last 15 years or so. But at its core, we've been studying, at any given time, over 100 sites and cataloging really the urban ecosystem. So we first started out looking at using trail cameras, and that was to look at the terrestrial mammals that are present in those areas. So we have a ton of amazing photos. And if you're interested in that kind of work, I'll point you to chicagowildlifewatch.org, where we put a lot of our photos online so you can help with the classification of those photos. Um, and we had a huge biodiversity of animals that we were able to document there. But then we also were just sort of interested in the urban ecosystem as a whole. So not just terrestrial mammals. We did some arthropod sampling. We've done some tick sampling to look about the tick presence and their pathogens. We've done some ant sampling. We've done some vegetation sampling. We've done some mist netting as well for birds to understand about bird populations and also their pathogens. Um, but what we really didn't have a great understanding of was the bat populations. None of these methods that we were deploying were really able to capture the biodiversity of bats or sort of understand how their populations were changing over time. So why is that important? Well, bats are a very important part of our urban ecosystem, and we really need them to thrive. The bats that we have here in Chicago or in the Midwest are insectivorous, so they feed on insects that feed on us. It's estimated that they contribute over $3 billion per year of natural pest control to the agricultural industry. And bats help to pollinate plants that we eat or plants that develop into food that we eat. So a lot of agricultural crops actually depend on bats, things like agave, mangoes, banana, guava. And then fruit eating bats help to restore rainforests because they're consuming those seeds and then they're distributing them across the landscape. So, bats are part of the order Chiroptera. They're the second largest order of mammals. They make up over 20% of all known mammal species, which now I think is documented over 1,600 species that has been, documented by Western science. And they're distributed pretty much all over the world. Indonesia has has over 200 species alone. So you can see sort of the hot spots of bat biodiversity based, those red warmer colors are more species richness, all kind of centered there around the equator. So, of course, to be able to live in these very different habitats, bats have extreme kind of phenological diversity. They have all different types of ear shapes, nose shapes, wing shapes, different tails as well. And that's so that they can be really adaptive to all of these different types of environments and all of these different diets, for example, that I mentioned. And they use a lot of different strategies, in order to survive in these varied habitats. So I always like to go through a few kind of common myths about bats, and kind of help to dispel some of those. So, one is that bats have really poor eyesight. And actually, bats do have pretty good vision. They do, however, especially those that are insectivores, so again, the bats that we have here in Chicago area, they do primarily use echolocation to find food, but they do also use vision as, one of their senses in order to detect prey that they're trying to find. And that really just depends too on the feeding strategy that they're employing. Sometimes they're echolocating and they're kind of locating insects as they're flying around. And then sometimes they're actually gleaning or kind of lifting insects or something that are off of a surface. And so in those cases, they might be relying a little bit more on vision or maybe, 50-50 or something like that. Another common myth is that they are flying mice. Well, I had mentioned, of course, that they're their own order called Chiroptera. They do fly, but they're not rodents. Rodents are in a totally separate order called Rodentia. And they're actually more closely related to humans. So if I was doing this presentation in person, I would have some bat skeletons to kind of show how their skeletons are very similar to ours. It's just that their hands are really their wings. So that's kind of the main difference. Another, common myth is that bats get tangled in your hair. I'm not really sure where this kind of myth comes from, but in reality, they're really just too agile to be able to do that or to be even interested in us or trying to be in our hair. There's really no reason for that. I think maybe where this comes from is if they're indoors, if they get sort of stuck inside and they're nervous and they're scared and they really don't know how to get out, they might be kind of swooping around a room and sometimes, just accidentally bump into someone, but they're not attracted to us or attracted to our hair or anything like that. Um, and then another myth I always like to talk about is how, folks often think that bats all suck your blood. Of course, they're often associated with Dracula and vampires and things like that. There's actually only 3 species of bats out of the 1,600 that are vampire bats, and these are limited to Central and South America. And what's really interesting about them is that their saliva actually contains an anticoagulant property, and modern medicine has been studying that property in order to create sort of anticoagulants for human medicine. So they're mostly feeding on domestic animals like cows and things like that. And when they bite and kind of take that blood meal, they're trying to keep that blood flowing. Often it's not even very disruptive to the animal. They might not even be aware of it. But typically, it's mostly geared towards domestic animals rather than towards humans. And then another common myth is that all bats carry rabies. I always like to say that rabies is certainly a serious virus and one to take seriously and to take proper precautions if you were ever to be bitten by a bat or kind of unsure if you were bitten. However, very few overall of probably the bats that are flying around in the environment actually turn out to be rabid. It's a pretty low proportion of those that are actually submitted even for testing. And those that are submitted are usually the ones that are actually behaving abnormally or they're found in people's homes. So again, all mammals can be infected with rabies. We always, encourage folks to take proper precautions, never to handle any kind of wildlife, certainly not with bare hands, and to report any animals that are behaving abnormally, but not to worry sort of at large that all the bats that are in our environment are carrying rabies and are going to attack you. All right, so then kind of some other fun bat facts that folks may not be aware of. They can weigh as little as a penny, but also up to 2 pounds. So you might be familiar with sort of these flying fox bats here on the right side. Those are, more often found in Southeast Asia and Australia. There's some fruit-eating bats that are also in Africa that are sort of those larger bats. Whereas we can have even these tiny, tiny bats like the bumblebee bat, which I think is found in Thailand. Our bats are, usually weighing between like a few ounces. They can feel really small in your hand when you're holding them. They're quite tiny, which is hard to believe, but in order for them to be flying, they have to have, be really light to be able to do that. Bats are also really long-lived, which can be really another kind of contradiction that you wouldn't expect given such a small animal. But the largest or the longest living bat that is known and was 41 years old, and that was a Brandt's myotis in Siberia. The bats in our area are living somewhere between 10 to 20 years on average, which is, again, pretty surprising given their size. Most species only have 1 to 2 pups per year, and some bat species can actually exhibit delayed fertilization, which means that they actually breed during the fall, but the egg doesn't actually get fertilized until the following spring when resources are more beneficial and they can actually, take advantage of the better resources. And we think the reason that they're breeding in the fall rather than just breeding in the spring like other animals is because in the fall is when they're sort of gathering around these hibernaculum and gathering in places where they're going for the winter. And so that's sort of the best time of the year where they can find other mates, versus in the spring when they kind of disperse more into their summer areas. Um, Bats are also, quite fast. They can fly up to 100 miles per hour. This was for a Brazilian free-tailed bat. And they can fly quite high, so up to 3,900 feet. I also just like to point out that bats are really, really hard to study because of their size, and we really don't have a lot of technology yet, although it's getting there. We're getting, much closer now to having really small trackers that have light batteries because you don't want to put something very heavy onto a very small animal, of course. So really the limiting factor is the battery size. Right now, the GPS trackers that are available for tracking bats really only last about 2 weeks, and that just gives you a very small snippet into what their lifestyle is like, what their movements are like, or where they're going for the winter. So there's really a lot that we don't know about bats, and their life history and what their ecology is like. All right, one little last kind of fun fact that I like to share is that the little brown bat was actually named Chicago's official mammal back in 2018. So the zoo had a 150th anniversary, and we work with the city to kind of promote some of the research that we've been doing around bats. And the city's council voted on the little brown bat as the official mammal, which is really exciting. And I'm not sure whether this is in perpetuity or whether there's a limit on how long it's an official mammal, but we just like to say that it's the city mammal for Chicago. All right, so kind of going back to why does this all matter? Well, over 52% of bat species in North America are at risk of severe population decline in the next 15 years. And globally, 23 species are critically endangered, 85 are endangered, and 113 are vulnerable. And 236 species are considered data deficient. So that just means that we don't really know anything about them. In terms of the bats that we have here in Chicago, we typically would expect to find 8 species in this area, and 3 of those species are now considered critically endangered, or being considered to being listed as endangered on the federal endangered species list. One of the major reasons for this is white nose syndrome. You may have heard about this pathogen. It's a fungal pathogen that has been rapidly spreading across North America. It was first detected in 2006 in upstate New York, in a cave system. And unfortunately, when it is detected in a cave, it usually causes or has caused over 90% mortality in the species that once were present in those cave systems. So, huge population declines of those species that hibernate in caves. Not all bats hibernate in caves, but for those that do, this can be, an extreme conservation risk. Where we see sort of those bats that are surviving are those larger bodied bats that are less vulnerable and are able to kind of overcome the pathogen. but it has been really devastating to North American bat populations. This is just a map of kind of how the different colors represent the time periods at which this is rapidly moved across the country. It was found here in Illinois in 2013. And it's a pathogen that thrives in these fungal or in these cave, in the kind of the damp, cool environment of a cave system. So it doesn't live outside of the cave. It's not something that humans need to worry about being exposed to. It's not zoonotic. But when bats are going to hibernate in these cave systems, they encounter this fungus that's living there. It's also passed between bats because the bats that are hibernating are very social, and so they're interacting with one another, passing this pathogen, and it can be pretty devastating. The main thing that it causes is arousal during hibernation. So of course, bats when they're hibernating, they have really limited resources to extend their lives across that hibernation period. And if they're waking up during the wintertime, they're often dying of starvation and of dehydration. There has been a lot of research going into white nose syndrome and mitigating for that. There's been some really interesting stuff coming out about how for those bats that are surviving, what those genetic shifts are happening, how they're surviving, and how that's changing the genetic makeup of the population. And it tends to be survivors that have a higher ability to store fat. So again, that body size is more associated with survival, as well as some genes related to hibernation, arousal, and social communication. Another major threat that bats are facing is wind energy development. So this is affecting kind of more of our migratory bats. So not the bats that are hibernating in caves, but another group of bats that are actually going into warmer areas for the winter. They're flying across these, open areas like in the Midwest where we see a lot of these wind farms. And they're colliding with the wind turbines, and we're not totally sure why that's happening. There's a lot of different hypotheses as to why they seem to actually be attracted to the turbines, not just that they're kind of accidentally flying into them. We think I think one of the prevailing hypotheses now is that bats actually may think that they are trees because they're a very tall structure on the landscape in an open area where there's typically not a lot of trees. So they may be sort of actually attracted to those turbines. Unfortunately, this is causing hundreds of thousands of mortalities per year, but there has been some mitigation that has been successful. So working with the wind energy companies to kind of turn off the wind turbines from turning when bats are, during peak migration. We can, of course, detect that with acoustics and to be able to study when bats are coming and when they're leaving, and kind of coordinating that with wind turbine companies. Some other impacts to bats, of course, is persecution, conflict with humans, bushmeat, which is when, folks are, eating species like bats or some other animals as a major source of protein, and that's particularly in Africa and Asia. Habitat loss is another big impact to bats, as well as pesticides use. So, pesticides can harm bats by directly poisoning them through contact or through ingesting insects that have been impacted, but can also impact them indirectly by reducing their food supply and kind of contaminating their environment. So, the major reason why we were really interested in studying bats and kind of adding this to our urban ecosystem repertoire was that we came to recognize really that cities can provide really valuable habitat for at-risk bats. And the ways in which cities can do that is they can provide these artificial structures for bats to roost in. So a lot of bat species, not all, but some of them do like to roost in buildings and picnic structures and bridges like this picture. This is actually in Austin, Texas, on the Congress Avenue Bridge, if you've been there or heard of it. Austin is really doing cool stuff in terms of bat conservation and kind of turning it into an ecotourism opportunity for people that come to Austin. There's also a lot of concentration of foraging areas, so through native pollinator gardens that are actually attracting insects to those plants, as well as with artificial light to some degree. So of course, too much light is usually bad for bats, but at a moderate level, it could, these street lights, for example, in this image could attract bats or could attract insects if insects are congregating around those areas, bats are also going to be congregating, kind of benefit from that a little bit. And then also many of our cities, of course, are built around water. And so this is a essential habitat type for bats. We see them really benefiting from riparian areas. And then finally, in the Corn Belt of the Midwest, like we have the area surrounding much of Chicago, we actually tend to have more forest in cities than we do in the surrounding area. And bat trees are another very important habitat quality. They provide areas for roosting, for foraging, as well as for navigation. All right, so there's 12 species of bats that we would expect to find throughout Illinois. As I mentioned, 8 have historically been found in the Chicago region. Again, they all are insectivorous, so they're only eating insects. The species that I've listed down there below are kind of their most common species that we might expect to find in this region: the silver-haired bat, the big brown bat, the eastern red bat, and the hoary bat, as well as the evening bat. So these are species that we're kind of detecting regularly at most sites. And depending on the time of year, also at different amounts. We see the big brown bat a lot throughout the summer, kind of these other species more throughout, migration season as they're coming through or leaving for their wintering areas. Okay, so I kind of mentioned that we have these two key groups of bats depending on their overwintering strategy. So we have the cave hibernating bats. So they're hibernating in caves during the winter. They're roosting in buildings often, sometimes trees during the summer or bat houses. These are the bats that are typically really social. So you might expect to, in caves, you might see them in these big groups. And you've probably seen pictures of them in the hundreds with these maternity colonies where all the females are raising their pups together. And these are the species that are most vulnerable to white nose syndrome. So you might see the little brown bat as these. I've kind of indicated which ones have been really affected by white nose by the red, tricolored bat, the northern long-eared bat, as well as the big brown bat. The big brown bat, again, is not as severely affected by white nose syndrome. So although they can be positive for the disease, they don't seem to actually be as impacted in terms of survival. So they're not, their populations have not been decimated in the same way as the other species. And that's just because we think because they're a larger bat and they can kind of be a bit more resilient. So if I haven't said it directly, all bats generally leave the Chicago area during the winter. So we're not expecting to find many bats. There may be some that hibernate in buildings, over the winter time. But for the most part, they're all leaving this area, going elsewhere for the winter time, and then they'll come back again during the spring, probably in April or so. All right, and then we also have the migratory bats. So these are bats, again, that are leaving the Chicago area during the winter. They're going to places farther south where it's a bit warmer. They're remaining active kind of on and off during the winter in those locations, but they're going into probably bouts of torpor, which is kind of like hibernation light. It's not as deep of a kind of restive state, but it's another way that animals can use to kind of to conserve resources during periods where there's just really not a lot, but they are kind of in and out of activity during the winter, depending on the temperatures and the resources that are available. These bats tend to roost in trees more, in bark and sometimes even in leaf litter on the ground. These tend to be also more solitary or hang out in smaller groups, with the exception of the evening bat. So we have, again, the evening bat, the eastern red bat, the silver-haired bat, and the hoary bat. Now the bats, don't have a ton of predators, or at least not typical predators that we think of, but some of the animals that can impact bats are cats, so outdoor cats, when bats, especially for pups that are fledging, that might fall on the ground. Cats have been known to eat them. Certainly nocturnal predators like owls, you might see snakes or mesopredators like skunks or raccoons that are able to access some of the trees and things like that that bats are roosting in. And then we've also seen, diurnal predators like hawks feeding on bats that are resting. So while they're sleeping, they might get attacked by those bats. I've actually seen, or by those birds. actually seen footage of that happening at Montrose Beach here in Chicago, where there might be some bats that are migrating through and resting on the trees, and hawks will actually eat them while they're sleeping. And then another question, of course, I get is, what do bats eat? Well, they eat all kinds of insects. So depending on the species, they have different kind of specialties. But things from midges to moths, mosquitoes, beetles, flies, wasps, and ants. And again, these are insectivorous bats. Of course, bats around the world eat all kinds of things. There's been some really cool research that just came out documenting bats eating birds as they were flying, even. So consuming them, catching them, and consuming them on the wing, which is pretty cool, as well as amphibians and sometimes even small mammals. So all over the world, they have a bunch of different feeding strategies, but here they're relying on insects. They can catch things as they're flying, so otherwise known as hawking, but they can also catch things by gleaning, so kind of picking up insects that might be on surfaces like leaves of plants or even on the water. All right, and now I do have a video, so let me see if I can get this to work. Uh, see. Well, I might play it at the end because I don't want to mess with my setup here. It took me a long time to get these screens working. So let me play it at the end. It's a really neat video of a bat foraging. Okay, so the way that we are able to study bats is not actually by catching them, but to be able to record the sounds that they make. So you may recall that bats echolocate. They're using sound to be able to detect what's out there, to be able to navigate, to be able to find food. So they're emitting these sound waves and listening for those waves to return, and that helps them to hone in on a prey item. This is happening at an ultrasonic frequency, so above human hearing. The bats in our area are calling or echolocating above 20 kilohertz. This kind of just shows like the overlap between the sounds that these different species make versus, and that's the voicing in black, but then also the hearing in blue. So this is in hertz actually, so I, multiply it by or divide it by 1,000. So for bats, anywhere from 10 to 120 kilohertz. In our area, it's typically 20 to 120 kilohertz. And our human hearing typically only goes up to around 18 to 20 kilohertz. So we're not able to hear them, hence why we have to use pretty special equipment to be able to record them. Okay, so I just have a recording. This is what's called a spectrogram. So every one of these little hockey sticks that you see on this image is a pulse of echolocation call that bats are making as they're flying around. And these vary a lot in terms of their characteristics, where they fall along the y-axis, or which is the frequency, so how high they are, and then how fast they are. And so that determines kind of the shape of these various hockey sticks. So I'm just going to play you a call of a bat that's actually been lowered down so we can hear it, and then also slowed down so we can hear it, because these bats are calling so quick within milliseconds. So that's what it sounds like when you kind of slow it down, lower it so that we can hear it. This is what it sounds like in real time. So really fast. And then I pulled out a few more that are just to show you kind of the variation in the shape and the characteristics of those bat calls. This is that of an evening bat. You can kind of see these call pulses getting closer together. That's indicative of a feeding buzz. This is a silver-haired bat. This one is much more angled, so it kind of looks more, like a hockey stick, really. This is a northern long-eared bat. It's much more like high frequency. It starts up really high, goes down very low. It's very narrow, meaning that it's happening very quickly. And then this is a hoary bat. This is a bat that's calling at a much lower frequency, much flatter, and almost at human hearing. And it has a sort of much more elongated call. So we've been studying bats in this way by recording these echolocation sounds for a number of years now, since 2013. We essentially record them in a bunch of different locations. We look at the spectrograms after we've uploaded the calls. We use a software to kind of help us to do this. It helps us also to identify the animals that are, or the species that are present in those calls. And then we look at various aspects of the surrounding habitat to kind of understand more about how wildlife are responding to cities and how we can kind of create more wildlife friendly spaces for them. This is just a map of all of the various locations in which we've done this stationary monitoring. So this is where we put out these recorders. They're with a microphone attached to it, so you might see these at various locations when you're out and about. We've been doing this for over 10 years now. What's different about this, or what's important about this data set, is that these recorders stay out for at least 7 days at a time, and they record all night long. So they're only recording overnight, and they're only recording ultrasonic sound. But because they record all night, we can really get, a very broad look at what types of species are flying around in that area, and also be able to look at kind of their activity patterns as well and get kind of more information that way. We've published a few publications out of this, a few studies, one looking at sort of scale and how bats are keying in on different scales of habitat, as well as looking at sort of more applied considerations for planning habitat in cities. And I'm just going to quickly kind of go through that paper just to highlight it. I know we're getting kind of towards the end of time, so I won't spend too much time on this, but one of the papers that we looked at was kind of understanding more about kind of the makeup of the city, both looking at natural habitat as well as the distribution and complexity of buildings on the landscape, and also how urban noise, so the noise that we're making as humans down in the acoustic frequency, might be impacting bats. And what we found is, if you kind of look, these are all the different covariates that we looked at. The various curves are looking at the different species that we've studied. But essentially what it comes down to is that we found pretty strong relationships with water as well as with noise. And in this case, closer to water we saw more bad activity, and at quieter sites, we saw more bad activity. And what we see when we kind of look at both of these things interacting on the landscape is that even when bats are at their most ideal habitat, which is right next to water, we see that they are avoiding sites that are noisy. So being next to the most ideal habitat possible is not enough to sort of overcome the negative impacts of being in a noisy environment. And that's really interesting to know, right? Because as we're trying to plan these habitats for various wildlife, and especially for bats and with restoration and things like that, we want to know where are the best places for us to be putting forth our efforts. And so thinking about noisy areas, places that might be adjacent to, some kind of noise producing industry or venue of some type, is a really important consideration when we're thinking about building habitat for bats. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of get in quickly to the Bat Tracker program. So this is our volunteer-led research program, which is a community science program that we've been working on for the last several years. This was initially part of the Illinois Bat Working Group, which is a group that I lead, actually. And with that organization, we put together a protocol, a monitoring protocol, in which we have various organizations that are helping to coordinate volunteers to do this. And what this looks like is folks going out with equipment at night, in the evenings around sunset during the summer when bats are most active, and actually recording the calls that bats are making as they're flying around. So volunteers go out for about an hour, and we have that red kind of square thing at the top here of the iPad is a microphone that records ultrasonic sound. And then there's an app associated with it, so you can actually see live what those spectrograms look like, or those visualizations of the calls. And then it automatically identifies those species for you as you're walking around. So you can really get that immediate feedback as a volunteer as to what you just recorded. And even sometimes you can look up and see the bat flying up around you. So we were fortunate to get some funding in the last couple of years to help us to really rapidly expand The number of sites where we have volunteers working, it's mostly based in the city, at least those that I coordinate. However, I work with other partner organizations outside of the city that are also organizing volunteers. So if you're not inside the city, I can sort of help to connect if there's folks who are already doing that work elsewhere. Um, and we have a really neat, I think one of my favorite parts about what we've been able to do in the last couple of years is to be able to create this data sharing website in which we have a public facing website where anybody can go on and kind of look at the data that's been collected. You can filter it by site, by year, by species, and kind of see where various bats have been recorded across the region. Last year, our volunteers recorded 7,300 bat calls, which was pretty exciting, mostly big brown bats, but also eastern red, evening, hoary bats, little browns. We got some little browns, some tricolored, and those are those species that are, severely impacted by white nose syndrome. So it's pretty exciting that our volunteers were able to detect those bats. All right. And then just to wrap up, I always like, to tell folks how they can help bats. The most important thing I think is to be able to try to reduce disturbance as much as possible by minimizing tree clearing, reducing outdoor lighting. And if you do have to remove a roost, say you have bats that might be roosting in your attic or something like that, trying to work with experts who are able to remove those bats humanely. There's ways in which you can exclude them using kind of one-way exits. Bats can, come out, but they can't come back in. And there's folks that are, certified to be able to do that responsibly. Planting a native pollinator garden, native plant garden is also really beneficial because those are attracting, the insects that bats might be foraging on. Even going so far as to think about maybe plants that might be attracting nocturnal insects would be really helpful to bats. Sometimes folks ask me about building a bat house. This can be really beneficial for bats, I would say, particularly when you're removing them from an area. If you have to cut down a tree where bats are roosting and you can then put up, a bat house to kind of supplement that habitat, that can be really helpful. I think often when there's a lot of natural habitat available, it can be really hard for bats to find the bat house and occupy them. There's some great research out of Joy O'Keefe's lab at the University of Illinois about how to create those bat houses in the best way to avoid heat stress for bats. So certainly encourage folks to go check that website out if you are considering building a bat house. And then, a great way to help bats is really just what you're doing tonight, is learning about them and kind of helping to spread the word about their importance and to kind of dispel some of those myths and fears about bats. So that's all I have for you tonight. I'm happy to take any questions. And yeah, thank you so much for being here.
I love that picture. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
It's an Eastern red bat.
We do have some very interesting and thoughtful questions and comments. But I have one first, and since I'm the
Sure.
boss, I get to go first. Do bats return to the boxes from year to year? And do you have to clean them out after when they leave?
Oh, good question. I know that I've seen, so yes, I think they can return from year to year. I think they have pretty high, what we call site fidelity. So they come back to kind of the same locations. And I will admit, I'm not a big expert on bat houses, but I believe that yes, there is some cleaning, especially if there's been sometimes wasps can get into bat houses and can set up nests. And I think there is some cleaning that's recommended to kind of remove wasp nests and things like that before the bats return again.
Well, that's interesting. And I'm going to let my sidekick take over with the questions. Are you ready, Mr. Tilton? Steve? We can't hear you. Your sound isn't on. We can't hear you, Steve. Am I the only one that can't hear him?
No, yeah.
Can you
There
hear
go.
me now? Okay, there it is.
Yes,
There it
there you
is.
go. Hi, Rosie.
Okay, the first question said, does painting wind turbine blades black help reduce bird and bat fatalities?
Oh, good question. I believe that there was some research recently out about that very question that did show that sort of the reflective nature of wind turbines was contributing to the problem. And I think that was one of the things that they tested. So if I'm recalling, I believe that yes, that painting them to kind of reduce the reflection was helpful. I'd be happy to see if I could track down that paper for you because I do think that this is something that has actually been recently tested
Okay.
before. Yeah.
I would think it would be just the opposite, but I'm
Yeah.
not a
Um,
scientist. All right, the
I may
next question
interrupt for
is,
just a
how
minute,
do you
Liza.
reduce heat stress from a bat house?
Yeah, so what's really interesting about Joy's work, and I encourage you to go, she's with University of Illinois and she's with the Extension also. A lot of her work has shown that, some of the previous advice was to be painting them dark colors to, especially in the Midwest where we might have cooler temperatures. But what they're finding, I think, probably as our summers are getting hotter, is that sometimes bats can overheat in those areas and there's in those dark painted bat houses, and there's not enough sort of variation in their microhabitat. So one of the recommendations I think that she has from her research is actually to create these kind of I forget exactly what she calls them, but sort of water bath kind of buffers to go inside the bat house. And that's just to kind of help create some difference in the microclimate within the bat house. I've also seen it recommended that people use more rocket style bat houses. I don't know if you've seen those. So instead of sort of the traditional like rectangular one where it's just kind of one side, you can't really move around if it gets too hot on one location, right? You're just kind of in one place. Um, so the rocket style is more of a what would that be? I guess a cylinder. So it's round all around. And so bats can kind of move around when it gets too hot on one side of the bat house. And in fact, on a project that I worked on, we were installing those rocket box style houses instead of kind of the traditional like rectangular house.
Okay.
Excuse me
Another
one
question
minute,
from Mary
Steve.
is, would bats avoid areas which have sounds of predators? And then could those sounds be used around turbines, the big turbines?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if they would avoid based on sounds of predators. I mean, I would expect they would. They can hear in that, range of hearing that the predators that they would like hawks or things like or owls that would be making those sounds. I would expect that they would. There has also been some really great research about acoustic deterrence at wind turbines. And they have, I don't know if they've tried actual predator sounds, but they have tried essentially what I was studying here in the city is how noise could deter bats from flying towards wind turbines. And they actually have found it to be kind of mixed results. Like there has been success for some species. If I recall, it was eastern red bats that were more deterred by the sound at least that they were testing. But good question. I don't know if anyone has tested actual sounds of predators.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Mr. Doug already answered this. That's all I have. Are there any more questions from anybody?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to include any information that I am going to send a copy of this tape out later, and if you have information about any of these questions, you can send me the links and I will forward to our audience, everybody that's seen it or will see it.
That sounds great. Yeah, I always say every time I give a presentation, people ask questions that I don't always have the answer to. So I'm happy to do a little research and send out more information. There's, just so much to know about bats. It's I'm still, even though I've been studying them for over 10 years, I'm still learning. So
They're wonderful creatures. They're just incredible. And I have another question. Um, the iPads with the antenna, do
yeah.
you have those? And is it possible for someone who was just curious to get a hold of that equipment? And where would one go? And you can include this to me and I can send it out if you don't know.
Sure. Yeah. So we do have sets of those equipment. Right now, of course, bats aren't here right now, so we won't be getting started again with our research until probably May or so. And depending on where, I know folks are kind of distributed maybe around northeastern Illinois. So depending on where you're located, there might be organizations closer to you than I am at the zoo who also are doing this monitoring with volunteers who have the equipment too that you can, take out and kind of be curious. I know if you're in Lake County Forest Preserve District does this work too.
Oh,
And but yeah, otherwise folks sometimes ask me about buying their own equipment, which
right.
is possible. So, for uh, if you're a hobbyist and you're really excited about it, you may be willing to spend the money on one of those microphones because you can use them with any kind of device. They have them either iPad friendly or Android friendly as well. They're through a company called Wildlife Acoustics. And they make two versions. One is kind of the professional version, which is what we use for our research. It just has a few different settings on it that make it, a little bit more research grade in terms of the recordings that it makes. But then
Right.
they also have a hobby version and I think the price is something like the difference is like $250 for the hobby version and $350 for the pro version. So I do know folks who are just really excited about it and will buy one for themselves to have, to go out in their backyard and
Well,
just have
I actually know people that would. Will you tell me the name of the company again? And I will include it in the email.
Yes, it's Wildlife Acoustics, and the device is called the Echometer Pro,
Thank you.
or just the Echometer, I guess, if you're not getting the pro version.
I actually, I actually know somebody who will pursue this,
Okay.
and he's one of our Cincinnati people.
Oh, okay.
Um, well, Liza, thank you so much. This has been absolutely riveting for those of us who love this sort of thing, and we're so grateful to you for giving up your Sunday evening.
Well,
Um,
thank you. Thank you for
and
having me.
this will be our last 2025 Sunday Speaker Series, and we can't thank Eliza enough for joining us. Looking forward to 2026. We are hoping to have a February speaker series about another flying creature, the bees. And we're hoping to have, we're working on the details, but the beekeeping and the importance of bees and the terrible situation we find our honeybees in currently. So it's very important to anyone who likes fruit that we take this topic seriously. And again, you will be receiving an email from me hopefully later this week, and it will have an address so that you can replay this interesting program. I couldn't write fast enough for some of what you were saying, but thank you all for coming, and thank you especially for giving up your Sunday evening. And let's keep those bats in our belfry. It's very important.